Good evening, this is Pastor Dan at Crossroads Baptist Church, and this evening, June 26, 2022, I'm doing a video here that I did not plan on doing, but I was just thinking about this, so I thought, well, I'll do a short video try to answer a question that we got started thinking about in Sunday school. So if you hear anything in the background, got a fan going, an air conditioner going here in my room up above the shop here at our house, so you have to forgive any extra noise. So the question is, did Christ ascend into hell? Did Christ ascend into hell? We started thinking about this today in Sunday school, in part, in the last 10 minutes, 15 minutes of Sunday school. Didn't have much time to develop it too much, but we worked on it a little bit. So I want to pick up from what we were looking at in Sunday school and go from there. So the first thing I want us to observe is that the phrase, he descended into hell, or Christ descended into hell, something like that, is not in the Bible. It actually comes from the Apostles' Creed. And so that's where this idea comes from, the Apostles' Creed. And the Apostles' Creed didn't actually come from the apostles. It was developed over centuries by various people who had things in it and then added things to it. And Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, which is, I think, pretty familiar to anybody who's gone to Bible college or seminary in probably the past 20 years. It's kind of a standard work now. He covers this question in a section that starts on page 582, and so he actually spends quite a bit of time on this question. And as part of his answering this question, he traces the development of the Apostles' Creed through history, and he has a pretty extensive chart here that covers 3 pages. Now, I'm not going to reproduce that chart. I don't think it would be too helpful for us. But what I want to do is show you that out of the 11 versions of the Apostles' Creed that Grudem refers to, only three show the development. So if you look at this chart, here's the final text of the Western Creed. So we're talking about the Western Church, so this would be what would become the Roman Catholic Church. So they wrote in Latin. You see that there up in the first row. Okay, that doesn't count as a development. That's the final product, and it's in Latin. And you can kind of see the English words there in the Latin. So you know a little bit of Latin, even though you probably didn't realize it. So you can see the word descendit ad inferna. So that's, of course, descended. Ad is into or in. Inferna is hell. Yet, an inferno is a really hot big fire. So inferna in Latin is hell. And so there's only 3 versions of the Apostles' Creed that leads up to this. And you see the next row down, and the one is listed there is Pirminius, and his version's in English, and it's from 750 AD. So it's not quite like our English, but Grudem has modernized the letters and the spelling, and it says he descended into hell. So this is exactly what the final Latin version says. And then below that, in the third row down, you have Rufinus, who also wrote in Latin. This comes from 390, AD 390, and it says pretty much the same thing as the final text says, descended into hell. Then finally, there is the Sacramentarium Gallicanum. and that's from 650, AD 650, and again it's the same thing. So the earliest witness that Grudem uses here, or cites here, comes from 390. So that's the 4th century. So that's quite a bit removed from the events of the New Testament. Not a huge distance, but it's obviously taken on some development from the times of the New Testament. So this gives you a little bit of a historical view where this came from. Now, in the other ones that he listed some witnesses that go all the way back to 200, Irenaeus and 200. And Irenaeus kept a lot of the Apostles' Creed, but it doesn't have this phrase, he descended into hell. Tertullian, another very important church father, from AD 220, he wrote in Latin, and he doesn't have this either. He doesn't have anything referring to Christ descending into hell. So those are the two really early occurrences, and they don't say that Christ descended into hell. Yeah, and so even though this phrase that we're thinking about comes from the Apostles' Creed, it wasn't in every Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed developed over time, and as it developed over time, this phrase was added. So that's just a little bit about the historical development of this phrase. So we have already dealt with two main passages, 1 Peter 4:6 and Ephesians 4:8. We did that in Sunday school, and we saw that neither of these two passages really supports the idea that Christ descended into hell and preached the gospel to those who were dead. He didn't. These two passages don't actually support that idea, even though they are the two most common passages used by people to say that Christ descended into hell and that he preached the gospel to those who had already died. So there's a few, maybe half a dozen, maybe a little bit more than that, probably no more than a dozen other verses that are used. But none of those verses actually prove that Christ descended into hell. They're all taken to support in one way or another the idea that he did, but none of them say it, and none of them really can be used to prove that Christ did this. So remember, our question is not do we believe that whether Christ descended into hell and preached the gospel. That's not our question. The question is, does the Bible explicitly teach that Christ did this? Okay, that's the question. Our question is not, can we make the Bible teach that Christ descended in hell, but does the Bible explicitly teach this? So we have one more passage left that I just want to talk about, and then we'll be done with this topic. Now, let me tell you, I already told the Sunday school class, so I'll just say it on here. I don't believe that the Bible supports the idea that Christ descended into hell and preached the gospel to those who were in hell or Hades or whatever you might say. I don't think the Bible teaches that. So I tried to show that this morning in Sunday school, but I want to look at this last passage, 1 Peter 3:18 through 20. And so here it is. This is actually the last slide for our lesson. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who were formerly disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. And so the question is, well, does the Bible support this? Does this verse support this idea that Christ descended into hell? And so we have to keep in mind the context. So you probably should have a Bible there. in front of you so that you can look at the context of what's taking place here. So, turning my Bible to that phrase. So, Peter is encouraging his readers to be bold in their witness for Christ, even in the face of the hostile unbelievers all around them. So in verse 15, Peter has just told them to be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks a reason for the hope that's in you with meekness and fear. So that's setting the context, and in verse 18 it begins with an explanation. So there's an explanation that's going to be given. And so if we look back at verse 17, it says, "For it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." Verse 18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins." So again, Peter's trying to encourage his readers in the face of the difficulties that they have. And he's saying that it's better to suffer for doing good than doing evil, and that Christ suffered. Christ suffered. He was the just, but he suffered for the unjust. And he did this so that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. And then we have this curious phrase here in verse 19, "by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison." So it says, "by whom," referring back to the Spirit, "also he went," Christ, "and preached to the spirits in prison." Now, we see from verse 20, it tells us something about these spirits in prison who formerly were disobedient. Now, who are the ones who were formerly disobedient? Well, we're told, "when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah." So these are the people in the days of Noah. They're the disobedient ones. And when did this preaching take place? While the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. So this obviously can't mean that Jesus is in some way going to preach the gospel to these people in order to give them another chance to believe. That would have the idea of people having a second chance at belief. This is coming close to universalism. This second chance. After you die, you can be, the Christ can preach to you and give you a second chance to believe. Well, if that's the case, who wouldn't believe? Who wouldn't believe? But that's not the case. That's not the case. So when it's talking about he preached to the spirits in prison, I think the best way to understand all the elements that we see here is that this was done through the Spirit in the days of Noah. Now, who was preaching in the days of Noah? Well, Noah was preaching. And what was Noah preaching? Noah was preaching, judgment's coming, turn to the Lord. Judgment's coming, turn to the Lord. But of course we know nobody but Noah and his family actually did that. And they were destroyed in the flood. So when he's talking about preaching to the spirits in prison, I think it's best to understand that in some way, through the Spirit, or by the Spirit, and through Noah, that the message that Noah was preaching was a message of salvation that came from Christ. Now, we could go on and look at this more closely to figure out what this passage is saying, but what I want you to see is that this in no way would prove that Jesus descended to hell and preached the gospel to people who have already died. So this just doesn't prove that. Now, some people will say that Christ descended into Hades and led the Old Testament saints out of Abraham's bosom and took them to heaven with him after he accomplished his work on the cross. Yeah, and that has some appeal to it, but it assumes that the Old Testament saints couldn't be in the presence of the Lord before this, and there really isn't any indication in the Bible that the Old Testament saints were excluded from being in the presence of God before Christ's ascension. And so there's several verses that would indicate that Old Testament saints who believed and died were actually in the presence of the Lord, or the presence of God. That's probably a more accurate way to say it, when they died. So anyway, this is the last verse that we're going to look at in this study, and I'm not saying that this verse isn't difficult to understand, but what I am saying is that this verse doesn't prove that Jesus ascended into Hades and preached the gospel to these people who have already died. This verse is much more understandable according to the words in the context, that in some way the message of salvation was preached through the Spirit and through Noah to those on the earth in the days of Noah at that time. So anyway, you can keep on thinking about this and keep on asking the question, does the Bible explicitly teach this? And remember, the evidence we have for the idea that Christ descended into hell comes from the Apostles' Creed. That's where those words come from, and they're not found in the Bible. So anyway, you keep looking at that, you keep studying that, and if you find something different in your Bible, you can let me know. I'm more than willing to learn something new and be shown something a little bit clearer in the Bible, something a little bit different, but it's got to come from the Bible. Okay, it's got to come from the Bible, clear understanding of the Bible. Well, hope you have a good evening this evening. This was just a quick video to sort of cap this off as I was thinking about it, and the Lord bless you as you continue to live for Him.